And welcome to another ACCELN Hangout. It's our ACCE 2016 special. Hi, Amanda.
Hey, Roland.
And it's a place where we can share our learning and teaching adventures and dream about future professional learning adventures.
And as usual, if you're watching us live, you can post a question to our panel by going to todaysmeet/ACCELN. On Twitter, you can use the hashtag ACCE2016 or ACCELN. Or if you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment there for us to read as well. We like multitasking.
We do it well. I'm Roland, Gesthuizen, a teacher from Victoria, Australia. I still play Minecraft. I roster my kids to do housework with a game called Chore Wars. It's a game I learnt in Queensland, and I'm an uber nerd and I'm proud of it. Hey, Amanda, I'm going to be dressing up a group of our students. We're going to pretend as if the apocalypse is coming at school. We're simulating a nuclear holocaust, and I'll be running around taking Geiger counter readings of millisieverts, they're like bananas, around the school, dressed in biohazard uniforms. That's 21st century learning for you for the coming nuclear apocalypse.
That sounds pretty awesome. Sounds a bit like a game I've played once. Hey, I'm going to be dressing up too this weekend, but I'm probably going to be dressing up as Princess Anna and going to see Disney on Ice. So that's a bit different from it's zombie apocalypse. So for those who don't know me, I'm Amanda Rablin. I'm an e-learning coordinator from Brisbane, proud QSite member, and I like to sometimes pretend that I sing. And so disclaimer for this session, because Bruce has mentioned letting things go, I may accidentally break out into Frozen theme song, and apologies for that. Should we get to know our very special guest for this evening? Yes. So we have with us Bruce Dixon, and he is going to be yet another ACCE 2016 keynote and asking us some very exploring profound questions with us this evening, and I can't wait. Bruce, would you like to give us a brief intro to yourself and your very, very vast bio that you have?
Well, I better not be too vast, otherwise everyone will go somewhere else. So I'll try and keep it fairly, or enthralled, yeah, one of the three. Yeah, my background has essentially been on all aspects of this industry that we work in. Been a teacher, taught and worked in Queensland and Victoria, and then worked in the industry. Just to jump forward to where I am now, most of my work in the last probably decade has been around the foundation that I set up in North America called the Anytime Anywhere Learning Foundation. People who are interested, it's aalf.org, which has been advocacy and thought leadership around what happens when every child has access to their own fully functional computer. And also in recent times, I've done a lot of work with Will Richardson with modernlearners.com, which is a weekly newsletter that we send out to leaders around the world. And that's allowed us to keep in touch with people. In the last 2 weeks, I've had some rather interesting adventures which are sort of relevant to our discussion. I've been hosting some panels across Queensland, Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, talking with teachers around the impact that Access is offering our students and what we can do to ensure we get greater impact. So a diverse background across all sectors, but I've been very, very fortunate to work with and to meet some extremely innovative and very clever people, and that's really what we want to work on in our discussion tonight.
So, Bruce, I mean, you're very well connected in terms of education and travelling around the current happenings. Is there a shake-up in store for schools?
Well, the question we put to lead this discussion tonight was, are we seeing the end of school as we know it? And it's at this point that I know I can reach across and do this and sort of say, have you seen my book? But I wouldn't be as blatant as that. I wrote a book. I wrote a book about it because I think the answer to the question fits into one of three, and given we're in this political time, it's sort of survey time, but our survey can be a fairly limited one. So the answer is, are we seeing the end of school as we know it, is either yes we are, no we're not, or no we're not, but we should be. And it's really interesting when I've worked with schools across this country in the last week across those 3 states. I'm also working in Western Australia, and then In the last many years, I've worked across some 48 countries around the world, and probably in the last 5 years, I've asked many of the audiences that, and you've got to break up roughly in thirds, as you'd probably expect. But in the last 2 to 3 years, I've seen more and more people tending towards the last option. A lot of people are threatened by the question. So firstly, you have to say to people, we're not trying to say the end of schools. What we're trying to test is the end of schools as we know it. So people who don't believe we are seeing that end, I think, are probably not well informed. I would have thought that there is an inevitability that we are going to see a dramatic change in our schools, transformation, call it whatever you like, disruption if you're a fan of Christensen or whatever. But it seems to me that most people do believe inevitably we will see that, but I think a lot of people are getting impatient. And I think that's the exciting time. I think what we're seeing now, that people have started to create that environment that we might call a modern learning environment. They realise now what's possible. And I think prior to the development of this notion of a modern learning environment, many people thought that any great transformation was going to be very difficult. And by the modern learning environment, I'm putting down a prerequisite that every child has access to their own personal, portable, fully functional computer. I'm assuming that through that functionality, it will enable them to do the sorts of things that they couldn't do before, to do them at a level of complexity that was not previously available to them. And by virtue of that statement, I believe we will dramatically change the way that schools function. Now, it won't happen through osmosis or through natural selection. It will happen only if we want to work towards that. But I think that in Australia, we're in a very, very unique position because we do now have an experience across this field for probably the last 10 to 15 years. We have large numbers of students and teachers who have been equipped with their own personal portable computers. And it's meant that teachers are now more able to see the possibilities. So whilst we've had too many distractions, and I can talk about those if we want to, I think between the distractions we can see a clear path, and we are starting to see examples of not just classrooms that are transforming, not just clusters of rooms or teachers that are transforming, but schools that are now looking very differently at the way that school could and should be.
So what kind of changes have you seen in these structures, and what types of learning have been emerging in this kind of environment? Have there been really radical shake-ups or more of a slow kind of evolution?
Well, the phrase I said before about allowing kids to do things they couldn't do before at a level of complexity that was not previously available to them is, as you may know, or viewers may know, a quote of Seymour Papin's. And obviously a lot of our work, and frankly pretty much the work of all of us that are in this field, is influenced very heavily by Papin's work. Very sadly, he's of course no longer able to communicate with us. But so along that lines, I remember when he was out here in 2003, 2004, having a discussion with him. And his question to me was, do you think we're going to see fundamental change or general improvement by small steps forward? And I think the answer is that most people believe it'll happen through small steps, but maybe in Papin's mind it would only happen through fundamental change. Now, fundamental change could be a very good example of that, could be new schools. So as our viewers would know, we've got examples across this country and around the world of schools that have started out and been set up with very different structures. And those very different structures, I think, have allowed a very different view of school as we know it. Within schools that are currently existing, that's a bigger challenge, and it certainly depends very much on the governance of those schools. So, for instance, within small cluster of schools such as Catholic school dioceses or school districts in North America, there's more readiness to embrace a change across a whole sector, as opposed to, say, across the whole state school sectors in Australia. But back to your actual question, I think the mistake that most of us have made is that despite what we said, too many of us probably believed that simply equipping young people with their own personal computer would bring about transformation, that somehow the machine itself would bring about a change in what happened in our schools. And I think that, to be fair, was very much a lot of what Papa talked about, and certainly what people like Nicholas Negroponte with the one laptop per child initiative. His initiative, for instance, in Uruguay was the distribution of 470,000 $100 or $200 computers to every student across the primary sector in Uruguay, with the belief that as a result of the child simply having that device, there would be a transformation in what school is. Now, of course, we have our own example, the digital education revolution, which I think was in many ways an unfortunate mistake. I think it was, I won't go into great detail, I can if you want to, but I think unfortunately that was a political initiative, not an educational initiative.
Yeah, and it wasn't exactly a revolution in terms of learning or school structures or anything like that.
Can I say it wasn't exactly a revolution? It wasn't a revolution in any form, Amanda. I think
that was just a label.
It was a hardware delivery platform. So I think it was a very big waste of money, and we shouldn't be saying it during a political campaign, so I'll try and be apolitical. But I don't think that Mr. Rablin or anyone that since has been there has done anything to advance the cause that we all stand for and the viewers who are watching this program stand for. And that's very sad, as you said, a misrepresentation of the word revolution, trivialisation of it actually. And really what it did was put us backwards. I think we went back as a result of that. And so Bruce, a lot of the work that I've been doing has been dealing with the confusion that that's left behind.
Bruce, I was wondering, we'd seen one-to-one in a number of schools. I seem to remember MLC decades ago having a one-to-one program that Gary Steger was pioneering. And I think teachers can see the possibilities of what we can do with this technology. When it comes to the traction of that pedagogy, there are some good pioneers there that are able to use them as genuine tools for amplifying learning. I'm pleased to hear about you mentioning Pappet, but I begin to wonder whether the brakes on the change aren't happening because of the technology, and they're not happening the lack of vision of the teacher, but perhaps the structure of a school, which tends to reproduce the expectations from the parents and the wider community, what they think schooling should be. And is that going to slowly change with the small steps, or once you begin to work on a larger scale, we can drive it?
You've raised a number of questions in that one question, Roland. Thank
Sorry.
you very much. Oh, no, brilliant. So let's take a couple of them. So firstly, just to deal with the technology, frankly, rather than being a catalyst, in too many cases, it's just been a major distraction. And I don't just talk about DER, I can talk about form factors, I can talk about the types of devices. And I'm sick and tired of going, into schools and having people put their hand on their heart and tell me they're going to talk about pedagogy, and all they do for the rest of the day is talk about technology. Back to your point, in the book I raised the term learning architecture because I think it's naive of us to believe we're ever going to see any substantial change, fundamental or incremental, or the end of school as we know it, unless we address the realities of what we call the learning architecture. And that's everything around the school through which it functions. So for instance, the ratio of students to teachers, the class structures, the age level structures of our grades, the subject orientation within our curriculums, the nature of our curriculum being a top-down delivered instruction set. And I think that we have to, rethink those parameters if we're going to genuinely see change within our schools. And those schools that are delivering the transformation are addressing those areas. So you've got much more flexible class structures, much more flexible age structures. You've got a very different view about what subjects are and about a broader range of thinking about what the focus of learning should be for our kids in those schools.
So the picture that you paint is one that we need to rethink schooling, in a sense reboot everything that we've come to understand school to be, where you've got this vertical division into subjects, horizontal division into years, and even a gender segregation in the way that perhaps the way we particularly do things.
I think, yeah, yes, the answer is yes, but let me just put one rider on that. I think it's easier when we talk about this to talk about that space of school in the middle, and I don't just mean middle school, because I think when we talk about any radical shift in what school is, we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and everyone starts to think of everyone from sort of 4 years of age to 18 years of age all going through the same process. The area that I think is ripe for change today, right now, is that space between the first 3 years of school and the last 3 years of school. And I think it's in that space that we should be focused. I think that our community is not ready for a complete shift in our thinking across the whole of schooling. And I think the point that you raised about engaging community is one of the fundamentals that we have to address in a much broader way than we have to date. The educational debate in Australia is led by journalists and politicians. No better example than the article by Natasha Bitter in this weekend's Australian regarding the use of computers and the amount of screen time that kids should have. And so if we're going to advance this thinking forward, we have to take the lead in the conversation around the wider community, not just across faculty, not just across parents. And we have to help them realise the possibilities for young people. But we can't, we have to be sensitive to the realities, and the realities are that the first, and we can discuss, you know, the length of which this goes, but the first 2 or 3 years of school and the last 2 or 3 years of school, frankly, you know, for the intervening period, I would leave them alone largely. I think if we focused on those middle years and we said, what sorts of experiences do we really want our young people to have in those years? What are the places that we want them to go and understand and learn about? And what are the things that they need to have so that when they get towards their end of their schooling, they're better equipped to make decisions about where their talent lies and what their ability is? Now, just one quick example. You said about rethinking the structure of school. It is, again, not like saying, well, why are we doing mathematics? But rather saying, what is the mathematics that we should be doing with young people in a digitally rich environment? And in that area, I'm a huge fan of the work of Conrad Wolfram. I'm sure most of your viewers, if not all of you, have seen the TED talk that he does, and I've worked with him in a number of places. He's not saying mathematics isn't important. What he's saying is we've got to stop thinking about mathematics as a paper and pencil activity. That all of a sudden, if young people have these things in front of them called computers, then we've got to let them do the computing and let kids apply themselves to the higher level mathematics, the mathematical thinking that technology will make possible for them. Now, that's a message we have to take to the wider community, and that's the sort of space that we want our young people in those intervening years exploring in real detail and working at a much higher level than is possible when they're working in this hard copy world that we're familiar with.
So I guess the issue at the moment is, though, that we're trying to fit these one-to-one technological devices that were rolled out, whether we want them or not in many cases, into the existing view of what learning is, and that's quite often the pen and paper. When maybe, as you're suggesting, what the question we should be asking is, how is technology used within this discipline, within this subject area, and what kind of learning should take place because of that?
Absolutely, man. A good example quickly is science. Let's go to science. I talked about mathematics. I often say to a group in a workshop, tell me one scientist in the world who today is working, who isn't working in a technology-rich environment. That's any scientist. That's an archaeologist, a climatologist, a chemist, or whatever. And yet so much of the science our kids do is about, learning stuff that other people know. Science is about discovery. It's about the process of science. And that may not have been possible for all kids in many environments prior to, the digital world, but today it is. We can give kids access to so many resources, to so much of what isn't known, that they can absolutely go through that scientific process and learn the process of scientific discovery. Best example I've seen is over at Science Leadership Academy, Chris Lehman's school over in Philadelphia. I mean, an absolutely brilliant school, doing amazing work, and just shows the way science should be in a digitally rich environment.
And it's not about sorry, Roland. It's not about then accessing resources to learn the science content. It's being a scientist, using the tools that scientists use. So yeah, that's really cool.
Again, and I don't want to overdo it, but to quote Papert, it's not about learning science, but about being a scientist and about learning the excitement, inspiration of discovery.
Absolutely. And I'll pass back to Roland, a science teacher.
Thank you. No, you're so right. Science isn't just about the teaching of raw facts and the kind of regurgitated on cue. I think someone once made the comment that why was it a squared plus b squared equals c squared, Pythagoras' theorem was popular, and why Ohm's law was popular, because they're easy to test. I think that you've got that discernment, that integration, that collaboration, that questioning, that very deep understanding about where this is going to tie into the social web of our life. We've got about science adapting technology, challenging each other. That's the real world of science as I know it. But we skit around it sometimes in schools, and it's nice to see it starting to happen more now.
Yeah, I think, as you also know, Roland, those four initials have all of a sudden meant people are refocused back into science, and you'd think that Australia, or dare I say it, Mr. Pine invented the word STEM, the initial STEM, but the one thing I think we should be grateful for is it does refocus people's minds. I mean, no one, by the way, pays attention to the E, and they think that T is just about a laptop, but let's ignore that. But I mean, I think if nothing else, it has at least refocused people back into those areas of the curriculum, and it's allowed people to think more widely. And as you'd both be aware, and most of our viewers would be aware, the whole maker movement and the emergence of the work of Gary Steger and others in that space has been, quite significant, and I think it's making people rethink what is possible in that space.
So what are some top questions? I mentioned Christopher Pine here. Some of the top questions, or perhaps depositions, that leaders and policymakers need to consider when they're dealing with rebooting schools?
Well, the first one, and I've just got to make mention of this while we're talking, and I meant to make mention of it when Amanda was making a comment, is the first one is that the idea of young people having their own personal, portable, fully functional device is not so we can test them more often. And I think that, sadly, we, as part of the distraction that I talked about before, we all should be ready for the onslaught of NAPLAN testing online, because all of a sudden, so much of people's focus is going to be around that space. And we only have to look at our colleagues in North America to see the appalling outcomes that are coming out of there in this area. And so I think that, we have to, I would start by certainly asking Mr. Birmingham or whoever, I'm trying to think very carefully, whoever may, Kate Ellis, maybe our education minister in a couple of weeks. I think we have to be very careful about the sorts of questions that we ask that hopefully provoke them to be more ambitious in their policy. So a good example of that is our national curriculum. I don't know whether you remember, but national curriculum was nearly concurrent with DER, yet I'll say no, but very little of the national curriculum had any reflection of the digitally rich environment that DER supposedly was preparing our students for. So our curriculum pays lip service to the notion of a technology-rich environment, and it doesn't really embrace the possibilities. I was lucky to work with Richard Olson and other colleagues at Ideas Lab for a number of years, and we simply worked out there with one question, which I would like to use as a discussion starter with any politician, most notably a new Minister of Education, and that is, what's now possible? You know, let's stop saying we should be doing what we've done in the past, but let's ask ourselves what is now possible. What can we now do that we couldn't do before? What could young people now do? And what do we have to do to empower them to achieve that? What are the barriers they have? What is the learning environment that we can create that will make it possible for our young people to do that? How can we change the environments of our schools to make that possible? And I don't think the distraction of talking about screen time, class sizes, NAP plan are going to get us anywhere. I think that it's about time we reframed the national conversation in this space and got focused on where we should be going rather than where we've been.
We actually, sorry, I was just going to interrupt. We've got Mark on Twitter who's made a, it's the second time I've interrupted you. I'm sorry, Roland. Mark on Twitter who's, apart from also sharing the Albert Einstein quote, we cannot solve the problems we have created with the same thinking we use to create them. He's put forward that maybe the systems of education more threatened than educators are themselves with this challenge of new ideas of learning, or this redefining school. Is it more of a challenge for the systems and the teachers?
I'll try and be politically correct in my answer to Mark, and I really appreciate his comments there. I like the thoughts he's got around timetables and assessment as well, and agree with them very much so. I think that so many of us, when we look at what the barriers are to seeing a dramatic shift in the way our schools function, many of us believe the barriers are at the school level. Could they be schools? Could they be parents? I don't see politicians as the barrier, because I believe that they come in really as empty vessels, dare I say it, and frankly take advice from supposed, leading advisors when they get into office. I think the people we have to seek to influence the most are our policy leaders, because they are the people who need to grasp the vision, they need to grasp the possibilities, and they're not people that many of us spend much time with, or many of us even pay attention to, because we take for granted that somewhere between the head of a department or the head of a school and a politician, there's not much there. All the guidance for the key decisions in this country come from those advisors and from the policy heads. And to be really frank, we need more ambitious and bolder policy coming through. And national curriculum was a good example, I think, of a failure in that department. DER was an example of a failure in that department. I would be provocative and say there's much about the way that NAPLAN's been administered that is a failure, because it distracts. All we did with NAPLAN was follow the Americans. And of all the school systems in the world to follow, and you're talking, and I'm someone who's been, I think I'm coming up for my 93rd visit to America next week for ISTE, and I've got to tell you, of all the school systems in the world that you would look at and follow, the American system has very little to teach us. And so I'm surprised that we seem to want to follow over the path of national testing in the same. It's not that we don't want to assess and formatively assess kids and find out how they're progressing. We know that. But we've been too often distracted by this low-hanging fruit of national testing or national curriculum, when in fact what we need to be doing is focusing on supporting teachers, supporting them in new practice, and above all, focusing on school leadership, because it's at the school level that the leadership can put in place the policy that will make the realities for kids in classrooms. And we don't have leaders who are being given the support and the information to make that possible.
It's interesting that you're saying that the barriers of schools are not political. With this ambitious policy, do you think that we should throw everything out the bathwater and just start from scratch, or is there some really good research or what you see best practice that we should be exploring?
Well, when I said they're not political, I guess my main comment firstly on that is that I think the changes that have had the most impact in our school system have come from the left side of politics, when in fact I would have thought those changes may well have come from the right side. So I think we've almost got to see this change in spite of the politicians, and the only way we can do that is by showing leadership in the conversations, as I said earlier. And those conversations really have to be, as I said, led by educators through events such as ACCE, through research papers, through white papers that start to challenge the accepted norm of what we should be doing in our schools. I mean, I am a little bit tired of going into schools and being told about the virtues and importance of handwriting through primary school and even into secondary school. I'm a little bit tired of being told that what we're trying to do with computers is, you know, stop kids having any mental mathematical models. Or, I mean, I think we really lost the lead in the public debate, and I think it's important that if we're going to see any change, we have to start those conversations at a local level, and we have to have those models to show policymakers, and in turn then we have to take them to the wider media. And that's why, for instance, we have fairly random reporting of what's going on in our schools, and it often is distracting to any major significant transformation that may be possible.
It's difficult, and it reminds me of some of the things behind the McNamara fallacy. This sociologist, Daniel Yankovic, made a point. The idea that all we have to do is just measure better, measure more, measure smart. I know that many teachers are going around this time doing performance appraisals, and they're asked to come up with SMART goals. They have to be strategic, measurable. And I'm beginning to wonder, we're ready for a time where we need to come up with what I've heard, something called hard goals. Hard goals are heartfelt, they're animated, require vision, they're required, and they're difficult. They're about the hairy, audacious goals that you're passionate about, that drags you right out of your comfort zone and can drive real change. Do you think that that's quite different from the more comfortable measuring that we might have been doing in the past? And that's perhaps what is needed, a bit more passion and a bit more drive and a willingness to drag yourself out of your comfort zone.
So are you saying teaching should be seen as a brave career choice rather than the boring standard default you do if you can't do anything else, which is so not true. So it's more like teachers should be rock stars, getting out there, showcasing their vision, their ideas, and putting this new reality forward, or this reality that's actually under the surface that we don't really talk about because we're a bit scared.
I think both of you are presenting a more provocative question than the one that I originally raised, which I enjoy. I like it a lot. I also like Roland, your quote of Jim Collins and his big, hairy, audacious goals. I try and find somewhere between, grand vision and reality, and then try and plot a path between the two. And all the work that I did about simply, empowering young people through access to the technology was built around that. We started in 1990. We've got 30-odd million kids around the world in a one-to-one environment. We were only able to sort of move to that space because we kept that bridge between the reality and the vision and tried to bring it through a range of strategies. Now, we've got to move on from that. I mean, that was just simply, as I said, providing access. And if we're going to be able to take these next steps, then we have to very much, address it at the policy level. We have to be able to make influences at that level. But above all, as I said, it's around empowering teachers. Now, if you say to most people we should be empowering teachers, firstly, they often say, oh, you mean we should be giving them a laptop? And the answer is, well, I'm assuming they have one, and it's sort of a professional insult if they don't have one. And by say that, by the way, acknowledging that I realise there are still some teachers in this country that are not provided with that, and I find that, as I said, professionally insulting. When I'm saying empowering teachers, I go back to your point, Amanda. I mean, I think we have many educators out there who have the vision, they have the ideas, they have the ability to bring about the change that we're talking about if we empower them, if we give them that professional freedom. And what's lacking in a lot of what has evolved in the last, let's say, 5 to 7 years, and it is most evident, and I'll repeat that, most evident in the United States, is a lack of trust. We are losing the trust that I think was maybe evident in our profession, say 30 years ago. It's certainly evident in countries like, obviously, Finland, Singapore, Norway. And that's where we need to go, because we're not going to bring about a change in the school experience without involving those people who are leading it, and that are our teachers and principals in schools. And too much of the policy in our schools, too much of the politics that grows from that policy does not reference our educators. They're the people who have the first-hand experience. They have the coalface experience. And sure, as I said, a number of them are very hesitant about change. But by and large, once you sit down with a group of teachers and you explore the opportunities with them, you start talking about the possibilities, they become inspired by that, and they become very committed to bringing about that change. And I think the community's lost the broad trust that we used to have in the profession. And I think it's not that we've lost it entirely. I'm simply saying that, the idea of testing kids to ascertain, where they're at, I think is fine. We need some measuring stick. But when you get to the point of, say, in North America, and there's talk of it here, and there certainly is talk of it in the United Kingdom, of measuring teachers' performance through student tests, it just demonstrates a complete lack of trust. So we need to rebuild that. We need to empower our teachers to have them believe that they can be very much leading this transformation to a very different view of what school could and should be.
I want to give you a high five because
it's good,
I'm
isn't
right
it?
there with you. Yep.
I'm sort of, I often used to say, it's sort of interesting how whenever I talk about this, I often have the frog sitting in the boiling water. And to me, that's where our school often, I see it today, that if we want to continue to hang on to school as it was, dare I say, when I went there, I mean, it's beyond a cliche to talk about what we know is wrong with the factory models of school, and whether you want to use, Sagata Mitra's views about how that is, and I know Sagata well, or whether you want to move, no matter, everyone agrees this is a factory model of schooling. So there's general agreement about that, and yet it seems that to move it beyond that and to say, now let's start thinking about how we go from there to the development and emergence of a modern learning environment, and let's make sure that's led by the professionals, by educators who are committed to this, who are going to embrace the possibilities, who are going to develop new pedagogies for deeper learning, for a higher order thinking with our kids, and engage the wider community in a broader conversation around the possibilities. For me, that's where we should be heading, and I hope that no matter who wins the election, that we do see a more respect paid for the professionals in our schools. That I hope that what we do is try and empower them so that they can be very much leading this shift. And I think the problem we've had is that if you look at much of for instance, the software and the technologies that have been around, educators are rarely involved in it. So much of the software around, dare I say, personalisation. I mean, how many politicians waffle around and talk about personalisation? And what they're really talking about is, the old computer-managed learning environment. I mean, their concept of personalisation has nothing to do with what educators see as personalisation, because they're dealing with, software developers and ed tech people, rather than bringing in the professionals to help them design these, to build these ideas out.
Imagine if they could be informed by academic research into personalised learning and what that workflow is all about, how it can empower learners, rather than it being, now log on and learn your little bit of content assigned to you.
Well, what a radical idea, Amanda. What a radical idea. We'd actually go to some academic research to actually look at what we should be doing. We'd actually, when Will Richardson and I do work in workshops, wherever we are in the world, the first question we sort of say is, can we start with a big discussion around how kids learn? Let's talk about how kids learn. Let's start with that. What are your beliefs about how kids learn? And once we've had that discussion, we move on to this space of saying, okay, so in what ways is that different in digitally rich environment? In other words, when we have kids learning in a technology digitally rich environment, how does their learning change? And what are your beliefs about that? Once you define that, you start to really lay down the foundations of where we should be going in terms of what should happen in our schools. Then we look outside and we say, what's the context in which our schools are now set? We can't ignore this world outside our schools, and that impacts on the way our kids are learning. And those two come together and then guide the essential third piece. And I've got my hands together, I can't show you my hands. The essential third piece, which is teaching practice. And so we need to be thinking about new pedagogies that reflect the realities of the world around our young people and the world around our schools, and our beliefs about how they learn. Put those three together, and that's where we should be heading. Now, I can't think of a more exciting place to be right now than looking in that space and developing the sorts of experiences within our schools that capitalise on these new environments and these new possibilities. And I think that's where we should be focused, and that should be the national agenda.
That's exciting, because it means that we're not just looking at butter churning and now looking at machine-delivered butter churning, but we're beginning to question the context and the place of butter churning. Fundamentally, Gary was quite right to point out to me once that how kids learn hasn't changed that much. But the learning that teachers are stimulating in the classroom, that learning environment, it's what we do really well. It's sometimes hard for us to explain. It's sensible when it's based on good research rather than just gut feeling. But we are experts in that business of teaching practice, and we need to keep a handle on the changes that we're seeing happening in the learning environment and the context. That's a really nice way of putting it.
Yeah, well, I hope that, I worry that at times there are so many distractions out of the core discussion that really, whether it's money or technology or governance, to keep us away from this discussion. The whole time we're talking about, policy guidelines from federal governments or testing, and we don't have enough around this space. There's very little, when the national curriculum came out, everyone spent a huge amount of money, had a ridiculous number of meetings around it. And for the life of me, I think it was just an enormous wasted opportunity. I think we've got to rethink the way we frame curriculum. My colleague Richard Olson says, curriculum's a guess. Once upon a time, it was a lovely idea. We could sit down and say, well, these are the things we think kiddies should know at this age, and these are the things we think that. It's ridiculous now. It's absolutely absurd. We know there are some things, yes. It's not that we don't know there are some fundamental things they should know. I'm not trying to completely throw that out, but I'm saying we've got to be focused more on how we can develop in them, one, a greater curiosity about the world around them and about the people they interact with, and yes, two, build that through that curiosity, the processes around which they can learn about how they can unfold and realise the possibilities of that world around them. And we have to give them the ability to want to learn, to continue to learn. And I don't like saying having them want to learn, because I think kids come to us curious. I think they come to us wanting to learn, and what we've got to do now is take that opportunity and allowed them to continue to do that throughout their schooling, so that we can develop in them a passion for learning, and we can identify their talents, which they can take into their later work.
And I guess if learning is something that is passionate to a student then, and the way technology is included in that learning makes sense to them, it's no longer a distraction. It's what they need for their learning. They won't be, you know, bored and tempted to do something that is off task or whatever, because it's up to them and in their control, which is really exciting too.
Well, you raise another point that we haven't talked about, and we could spend the next hour on. You know, that is what
we
kids
probably
are doing with technology in our schools. And I'll be fair, but for all the reasons we've talked about already, there is a lot. They could be doing a lot more, and if there are any challenges like the one you just raised, I think they are very easily addressed.
There's so much that we could have talked about tonight. I would love to talk about some of the disruptions, distractions, and some of the different ideas that you might have for the learning spaces and styles. But that's the whole point, I guess, of ACCE 2016, Amanda.
Sure is. We get to see Bruce for a whole keynote, and I'm sure he'll stick around to answer your questions as well. Yeah. So we'll check in a really long discussion with you then, and ask all the questions that we didn't get to finish talking about tonight, I'm sure.
Well, thanks very much, Amanda and Roland. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to have a bit of a discussion. It's certainly, after all this time, it's rather, what's the word? It's sort of heartening for me to be working with you and working with ACCE. I don't know whether anyone made mention of the fact that I was one of the founding board members of the organisation.
We'll mention it now.
And it's sort of interesting to go the full circle and come back and to be able to share some ideas. But I look forward to not just the keynote, but the time that I'll have with you two and with everyone else on this call. I really appreciate them taking the time, and people who look at it on YouTube, and also having those discussions offline up in Brisbane. It'll be great. And
I'd like to shout out a cheerio to our online audience. I know Wendy, I'm joining some of your posts, and also Mark Yates, who's now taking a career on teaching policymakers. And I think he raised a good point also, that there are so many other communities like the EdCamp, Teach Meets, and ACCE, LN, and the subject associations, and all the discourse that happens and weaves and winds its way around makes an exciting discourse. Now, really looking forward to catching up with you, Bruce and Amanda, in Brisbane in October with ACCE 2016.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
I'm really excited, looking forward to that as well. I'm going to throw out a last-minute challenge just because I'm cheeky. So if the standard model of education is a factory model and that's what's broken, what if we had a Kickstarter model of education instead, where the Kickstarters were actually posted by the students and not assigned to students by grown-ups instead? That's my troublemaking thought.
I love it. Love it. See it. There you go. We've had 1 hour and already we're kicking around some ideas. That's my point exactly, Amanda. The ideas are there. The people are there to make it. It's just that we've got to get out and lead it.
Just let it go, Amanda. The snow glows white on the ground tonight. Not a digital footprint to be seen. A kingdom in isolation. And it looks like I'm Roland, and I'm signing off.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Good night. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Good night. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks a lot.